Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. If you look at the bottom of your screen, if you could please like this video, subscribe, share with your friends, that would be great. I appreciate it. Today's topic is the relationship between the church and the state. Is there such a thing, a proper thing, as the separation of church and state? Now, I'm not going to be speaking from the perspective of the American Constitution or how it's been ruled, because that has little to do with Old World Order theology itself. It has more to do with the principles of the Enlightenment and progressivism that has sprung forth from that, naturally sprung forth, may I add. I'm going to come from both the biblical and the Catholic perspective. In short, throughout the Bible, in the Old Testament, you have the nation or kingdom of Israel, the priesthood and the temple, they were distinct from the kings or the patriarchs, but they worked together. They were not separated from one another as if the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. Similarly, even though in the New Testament the pagan Roman Empire ruled the world at the time, but even so, St. Paul in his letter to the Romans in chapter 13 referred to the state as a minister of God who rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked, right? Not bearing the sword for nothing, collecting taxes and so forth. So clearly the two have, even though the church, ministers to people and the state is also a minister of God, they work together. They're parallel to one another. They're separate in function, but not. But they're not essentially separated in the sense that they go different directions, because they both exist for the public common good. They're both necessary. So today I'm going to be reading from an encyclical from Blessed Pope Pius IX as we continue with his writings. And the reason why I'm beginning kind of this section, I could have begun earlier, but Pope Pius IX was really the one who aggressively, he foresaw what was going to happen based on the philosophy that was popular in his day, that was contrary to church teachings and contrary to society as he saw it. He was kind of the first who really started throwing haymakers towards secularism and all of its errors. Other popes did before him, but he's the one who really kind of comes out. He's the heavy hitter. He's the Mike Tyson of popes. He's trying to throw the knockout blow. He's trying to warn Catholics who he recognized as following after these errors, the danger it was to the church and to society as a whole, and to, most importantly, to the human souls for their eternal destination. So, and he was writing in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, the times that were about 2 generations or so after the French Revolution, where these ideas really kind of came from. So by that time, mainstream society had kind of eaten it up. They made certain compromises with their theology and this secular ideology, and little by little, they were, whenever Christians compromise, it isn't for the common good. When we compromise, the enemy wins. The enemy gains more of a foothold, because that's how Satan works. First he gets his pinky toe in the door, then he has all of his toes, then he has his whole foot. Then before you know it, the door is kicked wide open. Satan doesn't compromise for the sake of good. He wants us to compromise so that he can gain victory and foothold in our lives. So, Pope Pius IX, from his encyclical called Quanta, Cura, given December 8th, 1864, and the title, it's dealing with the philosophies of naturalism, communism, and socialism. So this was some 50 some odd years before the communist revolution in Russia, but these ideas were already floating around. And most prophetically, he kind of points out their dangers. And of course, we've already spoken of naturalism on this channel several times as being one of the three unholy members of the trinity of modernism, naturalism, rationalism, and liberalism. And communism and socialism come naturally forth from these. So let me read a paragraph from Pope Pius IX, quote, "Moreover, although we have not failed to proscribe and frequently condemn the most important errors of this sort, nevertheless, the cause of the Catholic Church and the salvation of souls divinely entrusted to us, and the good of human society itself, demand that we again arouse your pastoral solicitude to overcome other base opinions which spring from these same errors as from fountains. These false and perverted errors are to be more detested because they have this goal in mind, to impede and remove the salutary force which the Catholic Church, according to the institution and command of her divine founder, must exercise freely unto the consummation of the world." Matthew 28, verse 20. No less towards individual men than toward nations, peoples, and their highest leaders, and to remove that mutual alliance of counsels between the sacerdotal ministry and the government, and that happy concord which has always existed and is so salutary to sacred and civil affairs. For surely you know, venerable brothers, that at this time not a few are found who, applying the impious and absurd principles of naturalism, as they call it, to civil society, dare to teach that the best plan for public society and civil progress absolutely requires that human society be established and governed with no regard to religion, as if it did not exist, or at least without making distinction between the true and false religions. And also, contrary to the teaching of sacred scripture, of the Church, and of the most holy fathers, they do not hesitate to assert that the best condition of society is the one in which there is no acknowledgement by the government of the duty of restraining by established penalties offenders of the Catholic religion, except insofar as the public peace demands." Close quote. Okay, several things there. He comes out swinging in this encyclical, as is his custom. So first he says, the cause of both the salvation of souls and the good of human society has been entrusted, he says, to us, meaning the magisterium of the Catholic Church. So it's not just spiritually oriented only. It's not only the salvation of souls the Church has as her responsibility. It is the good of human society itself. So because Catholicism is not a spiritual only religion, because our religion is based on the incarnation of Jesus Christ, meaning the Son of God became flesh. So by the Son of God becoming flesh, that means he's not spirit only. That would be Gnosticism, heresy. It is both flesh and spirit. So it's the physical and the spiritual realms in which the Church has been entrusted, and for the salvation of souls. So what we do in the physical matters for our eternal destination of our souls. That's always been the mindset of the Church, right? So, and then he goes into these false and perverted errors, namely naturalism, communism, and socialism, that they have a specific goal in mind, which is to impede and remove the salutary force that the Catholic Church, for which the Catholic Church was instituted for, and that we were commanded to do so by the Lord when he says, "Go and baptize, make disciples and baptize all nations in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." So in order to do that, the Church has to be a part of mainstream society. It's not something like, oh, I get this a lot by well-meaning Catholics and Christians. Oh, I'm not going to get into politics. I'm only going to be concerned with spiritual things. But politics are merely the manifestation of theological and philosophical beliefs, right? Because people do what they believe. or at least, mostly, and if they don't, then they'll have cognitive dissonance. So if we do what we believe, then necessarily politics are religious in nature, or if you're an atheist or an agnostic, then they're secular in nature, because people are going to do what they truly believe, if they're consistent with themselves at least. So the commandment of Christ in the Great Commission commands us to be public with our religion. It's not a private matter. That's a heresy. We have to take our religion public. So our freedom of religion, according to the rights of God, not to the rights of man, has to do with religion as a practice. You could worship privately in your home, but religion is done publicly, right? And he also mentions that this is aimed towards nations and peoples. Being the universal church, our duty is to go into the nations. So that requires necessarily that politics are a part of it. And because he refers to sacred and civil affairs. Okay, then he gets into something contrary to the Catholic Church, namely naturalism. Naturalism is the philosophy that the only thing we could be certain of and know for sure are things according to the natural order. Basically, using the scientific method as the primary means of knowledge, right? So only things we could observe in nature are true. Everything else is opinion, is basically the era of scientism that he's referring to, secularism, right? So, we're not going to base our society based on the laws of God, not the law of Christ, not the doctrines of the church. No, those are private affairs, so these people say. We're only going to go according to what we could observe and test in a laboratory. So that really is a slippery slope, because then you get into all kinds of things, because scientists can only interpret data according to their presupposed beliefs already. So if your presupposed beliefs don't include God, they don't include church teaching, then it's already necessarily an error. And then that's just going to breed more error on top of error, and it has an adverse effect on society as a whole. So these naturalists, they want to establish a government with no regard to any religion whatsoever, contrary to the teachings of the church and the sacred scriptures. Okay, going to go into the next paragraph now. Quote, "And from this wholly false idea of social organization, they do not fear to foster that erroneous opinion, especially fatal to the Catholic Church and to the salvation of souls, called by our predecessor of recent memory, Pope Gregory XVI, insanity, namely that liberty of conscience and of worship is the proper right of every man, and should be proclaimed and asserted by law in every correctly established society, that the right to all manner of liberty rests in the citizens, not to be restrained by either ecclesiastical or civil authority, and that by this right they can manifest openly and publicly and declare their own concepts, whatever they may be, by voice, by print, or in any other way. While in truth they rashly affirm this, they do not understand and note that they are preaching a liberty of perdition, and that if human opinions always have freedom for discussion, there could never be wanting those who dare to resist truth, and to trust in the eloquence of human wisdom, when faith and Christian wisdom know, from the very teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ, how much it should avoid such harmful vanity." Close quote. Okay, really a lot here. So both Popes Gregory XVI and Pope Pius IX call society based on naturalism, with a complete separation of church and state, as insanity. Why? Because once society as a whole believes in things which are not true, it will devour itself. This is because we know what happens with original sin. So human nature by default is reprobate, unless the grace of God intervenes. So if human nature is reprobate and fallen by nature, its ideas that come from itself, from its own nature, are automatically perverse and an error, right? So when the American founding documents speak of things such as liberty of conscience and worship, that basically means liberty from. You have to ask, what does it mean to be free from? Liberty from what? From God? From the church? So you're just going to follow your own conscience based on your own beliefs. That's basically what it's saying. And also the liberty of worship being a proper right of every man. That is a violation of the first commandment. The first commandment is, I am the Lord thy God, and you shall have no other gods before me. So, no, human beings do not have a natural right to worship as they please. It was never so in the scriptures. The Israelites were not permitted to worship as they pleased. There were specific things they had to do. And likewise in the New Testament, Jesus says, if you love me, obey my commandments. And Jesus founded a church, and he set Peter and the apostles to govern the church. Acts 2:42 speaks of the apostles' doctrine. When you read the letters of St. Paul in the New Testament, he's speaking with the authority of an apostle. He's giving commands and instructions, and he expects them to be obeyed and followed. So this is the norm. So the founders of America, many of which whom were Freemasons, and others, they adhered to the philosophies of the Enlightenment, and the philosophies of the Enlightenment were specifically aimed to counter the teachings of the Catholic Church. So the two are not compatible. Sure, there's common ground because the Enlightenment people from Europe came from a society that was built on Catholicism. So of course there's going to be some common ground because it was imbued into their public and daily life, and sociologically, we pick up on these things even if we don't intend to. So, but little by little, by chiseling away at the church, they'll eventually create a society which is completely secular and antichrist. Because Jesus himself says, if you are not with me, you are against me. And if you do not gather with me, you will scatter. So that's the words of our Lord. So it is a dichotomy, and he draws a line in the sand, and you have to choose which side you're on. All right, and let's see, what else? That the right of liberty, human rights, rest in the citizens. So this is why democracy is the worst form of government, according to the ancient Greek philosophers and to several doctors of the Catholic Church, including St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Robert Bellarmine especially. So authority and rights come from above. They do not come from below. It is a top-down. It is a hierarchy. It goes God, the Father, Jesus Christ, apostles, church, people. That's how it goes. And in the household, it goes God the Father, Christ, husband, wife, children. That's how authority goes. It's not equal. Equality or egalitarianism, with only a couple of exceptions, is antichrist. Equality and dignity, being created in the image of God, and also equal opportunity in civil society, those are Christian ideas. But equality of persons functionally is ultimately against nature and against God. So when we talk about equality, we really have to make proper distinctions and be specific. Equality in what? The authority of liberty does not come from the people, from the bottom. It comes from God ultimately, and then from those who God has appointed over people. So democracy is antichrist in nature, because you can't have everybody simultaneously ruling. That's just chaos. And eventually people will vote in their own favors and they'll fatten themselves. And then eventually you will get an oligarchy of people who will conquer people who have fattened themselves on their own devices. So Pope Pius IX calls this liberty of perdition, for a good reason. Okay, next paragraph, quote, "And since, when religion has been removed from civil society, and when the teaching and authority of divine revelation have been repudiated where the true notion of justice and human right is obscured by darkness and lost, and when in place of true justice and legitimate right, material force is substituted, then it is clear why some, completely neglecting and putting aside the certain principles of sound reason, dare to exclaim, "The will of the people, manifested as they say by public opinion or in some other way, constitutes the supreme law, freed from all divine and human right, and that deeds consummated in the political order, by the very fact that they have been consummated, have the force of right." But who does not see and plainly understand that a society of men who are released from the bonds of religion and of true justice can have no other aim, surely, than the goal of amassing and heaping up wealth, and that it, society, can follow no other law in its actions except an uncontrolled cupidity of soul, a slave to its own pleasures and advantages. Close quote. Okay, so since it's already been established that those who follow naturalism and the ideas of the Enlightenment, their goal is to eliminate the church's role in civil society. So if the church is not there, then something has to be substituted. So what is that substitution? Is material force, materialism, right? So naturalism breeds materialism, because if the only thing that really exists for sure that we can be certain of to govern us is that the natural law only, then there is no such thing as the objective truth of God, right? The invisible, the metaphysical, right? You have to focus only on the physical and the materialism. So materialism is the basis on which communism / socialism. I'm not going to really make a distinction because it's all communism. It's based on materialism, and that breeds atheism, or agnosticism at best. And those things are clearly contrary to Christian theology and teaching. And so they claim that the will of the people, or the public opinion, constitutes the supreme law. So that's interesting. So it says will of the people as it is manifested by public opinion. So it's not really the will of the people, because public opinion can easily be manipulated by people who know how to manipulate it. People who have the tools and the skills of manipulation and persuasion, which are usually a minority in number, but they're just very talented at it. So like the 10% of people who are elites, by persuasion of material goods, meaning wealth, they have the ability to manipulate and persuade people to their cause. So in reality, what a democracy claims to be, that all people are equal and all people are ruling, in reality, it's 10% or less of elite people who have wealth. They manipulate at least 51%, the majority, to vote on what they want them to vote on, and then they rule over the 49% or more who might dissent from those opinions. So in reality, it's not, democracy will lead to an oligarchy. It will lead to elitism. It will lead to despotism because of these abilities. So democracy is actually a wedge to a dictatorship, an antichrist dictatorship. And even a republic. A lot of conservatives like, Republicans and republicanism, they think it is better than democracy because you're having people who represent the masses, but the same thing will naturally follow. It's really a via media between democracy and monarchy. And if you want to check out why monarchy is the best system of government, I have a video on, does God desire monarchy? You can check that out. So the will of the people it sounds good to the ears, but eventually it becomes the will of the elites. And then you have the divine and human rights being violated when that happens. Because when you place the rights of man on equal footing with the rights of God, then that's humanism, and ultimately it's Luciferian in nature. It goes back to Genesis chapter 3, eating the forbidden fruit. We shall know good and evil for ourselves and decide based on our own knowledge of good and evil, and we will be like gods, right? So the rights of God always come before the rights of man. And what is the supreme right of God is that we owe him worship based on who he is. That's justice. We owe God worship in the way that he wants it, not the way that we imagine it. That's the first commandment. Let's see, what else? A society who are released from the bonds of religion and true justice have no other aim than heaping up wealth. So that's why the church, along with condemning socialism, it condemns capitalism, because when a small group of talented people heap up wealth, they control who gets the trickle-down effects of that wealth. And since they are released from the bonds of religion, of true justice and virtue, they're not going to be virtuous with their wealth. They're going to be plagued with avarice, greed, and manipulation, because wealth does not satisfy the soul. You just want more and more and more, and wealth becomes an addiction. So this is the danger of capitalism without being regulated by virtue. And these are things that we observe in our society today. So why is it happening in our society today? Because there has been a wedge driven between church and state. And the Catholic Church, which had long been elevated above the state and even governing the virtues of the state, has been driven out of society ever since, especially since 1789 and after that, and slowly deteriorating, and society is deteriorating with it. So next paragraph, a couple paragraphs, quote, "Therefore, men of this sort pursue with bitter hatred religious orders, no matter how supremely deserving, because of their Christian, civil, and literary work. And they cry out that these same orders have no legitimate reason for existing, and in this way approve the falsehoods of heretics. For, as our predecessor of recent memory, Pius VI, very wisely taught, abolition of the regulars wounds the status of the public profession, the evangelical councils. It injures the way of life approved in the church as suitable to the apostolic teaching. It harms the most distinguished founders, whom we venerate on our altars, who established these orders only when inspired by God. And they also make the impious pronouncement that from the citizens and the church must be taken away the power by which they can ask for alms openly in the cause of Christian charity, and also that the law should be repealed, by which on some fixed days, because of the worship of God, servile works are prohibited, pretending most deceitfully that the said power and law obstruct principles of the best public economy. And not content with removing religion from public society, they wish even to banish religion itself from private families." Close quote. Okay. So once, this is all driven by the hatred of religious orders. So the hatred of the church is by people who have no faith in God, secularists, has driven the church out of the public arena. So, I'll give you an example. Before, the Catholic Church had several orders of charity that assisted the public good. So, they opened orphanages, hospitals, and universities, all of which help and aid people. And along with it came virtues to be practiced in the public. So in recent decades, especially since the 1960s and the Vatican II Council, the church orders have been being eliminated. A lot of them don't exist anymore, and very few exist. And what has replaced Catholic religious orders that help the poor? Welfare and the state. So where the church was removed from public society, the state has expanded. And now we have a massive welfare state with the increasingly increasing our taxes more and more and more to help so-called, supposedly to help poor people, and the state just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and they employ socialism more and more and more. So, and at the same time, the orders of the church, which have always helped the poor and the needy, have diminished significantly. Almost, in some places, almost are non-existent. And then, before, when most of civil society was closed on Sundays in observance of the Lord's Day, these same people that didn't want the church in our society said, well, that's not good for the economy if businesses are closed on Sunday. So, let's substitute that day of rest with more work. So, in other words, more servility, more slavery, for the public goods, so to speak. Let's see what else. And eventually, what this does is not only are these people content with removing religion from public society, they eventually want to get into your homes, and they want to banish religion from your homes. So once these principles are set in motion, all of your freedoms end up being taken away, and even in your own homes, as we clearly saw in history when the communists took over certain countries. Religion was more or less illegal. Bibles were not allowed in homes, and so forth. So once you allow the state to overstep its boundaries, to have a separate function from the state, and to take over the jurisdiction of the church, then all kinds of evil breaks out. And it happens, sometimes it's happened very rapidly, like in Russia and China in the 1900s. Other times it happens more gradually, little by little. Okay, next couple of paragraphs, quote, "For teaching and professing that most deadly error of communism and socialism, they assert that domestic society or the family borrows the whole reason for its existence from the civil law alone, and hence all rights of parents over their children, especially the right of caring for their instruction and education, emanate from and depend wholly on the civil law." Close quote. I'll stop there. That's amazing. This is prophetic. First of all, Pius IX calls communism and socialism the most deadly error. And this was before the Russian Revolution and in China and so forth. So he didn't even have those examples where millions of people were literally murdered in these takeovers. But he calls it nevertheless most deadly error. So this is divine insight that he has. He could just see by just connecting the dots and following sound philosophy. And then, these communists or socialists, they assert that domestic society or the family borrows the whole reason for its existence from the civil law alone. So basically, civil law, which, even if you have a democracy that could be manipulated by people, they can arbitrarily create laws to redefine family. What have we seen in recent years in the West? They've redefined marriage, so now men can marry men, women can marry women, and that really sets a precedent for an even more slippery slope. Polygamy, pederasty, pedophilia, dare I say bestiality could easily follow once that slippery slope of insanity, once that Pandora's box has been opened. So when civil law alone is the arbiter of truth based on what they might call naturalism or the scientific method or whatever they decide, and it could easily be manipulated, then all evil breaks loose. And then it will also trample, since society or civil laws can redefine families, then that also tramples on the rights of parents over their children. Now, according to the divine economy, according to the law of God, parents are the true and proper guardians and authorities over their children, and they have rights over them. That's the fourth commandment, to honor thy father and thy mother. And that's their primary job, is to instruct them and educate them in the law of Christ primarily, and then also the non-religious instruction as well. But once the authority is given to the state, then the state can remove the parents from the children as being their proper authorities, and then the state can send social workers into people's homes and make a claim that, oh, well, these parents are not instructing their children the way that we want them to, so they're therefore abusing them, and therefore we're going to take their children away. These things happen, and even in the freest country that the world has ever known, the United States of America, these things are starting to happen very slowly. Because the American people have always had a heart to fight against tyranny, they couldn't just take over the country immediately, like in some countries, because they know there would be resistance. But they've had to persuade them through media manipulation and so forth that certain beliefs are abusive to children. So they always want to go, these evil people, socialists, communists, and so forth, they always go after the youth. They're always aiming at the next generation. So that's why, if you do your research, you can see that, the CIA has been involved heavily in pop culture and music and entertainment, so that they can, control the minds of the children, so that they could shape and educate future generations through pop culture. But that's another topic for another time. But the main idea here is that the state cannot overstep its boundaries. Next paragraph, quote, "In these impious opinions and machinations, these most deceitful men have this particular intention, that the saving doctrine and power of the Catholic Church be entirely eliminated from the instruction and training of youth, and that the tender and impressionable minds of youths may be unfortunately infected and ruined by every pernicious error and vice. For all who have tried to disturb not only the ecclesiastical, but also the public welfare, and to overturn the just order of society, and to destroy all rights, divine and human, have always formed all their evil plans, studies, and worked to deceive and deprave, especially unsuspecting youth, as we have intimated above, and have placed all their hopes in the corruption of the youth. Therefore, they never cease to harass in every unspeakable way both clergy, from whom, as the genuine documents of history splendidly testify, have flowed so many great advantages for Christian, civil, and literary society, and they never cease to declare that the clergy, as an enemy to the true and useful progress of science and government, must be removed from all responsibility and duty of instructing and entraining youth." Close quote. Exactly what we see. This is prophetic. Okay, first he calls these people impious and deceitful men, and they have a particular intention. As we saw from previous episodes of the Freemasonic infiltration of the Catholic Church, and a lot of evil has come by that, their intention is to remove the saving doctrine and the power of the church from society, specifically to train the youth. So, why would anyone want the saving doctrines of the Catholic Church out of society? Where does that come from? That comes directly from Satan, because Satan hates human souls, and he wants as many souls to be in hell with him and his demons as possible. So in order to do that, he has to get the church out of society and out of the influence of the youth especially. And he also wants to corrupt the minds of the youths. Now, interesting that Jesus put a heavy emphasis on children. He says, if anyone were to put a stumbling block in front of these little ones, it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around his neck. So yes, Jesus is promoting the death penalty for those who abuse children, and that's not just sexual abuse, it's also psychological and spiritual abuse by training them in the wrong way, trying to manipulate their impressionable young minds with what Pius IX calls pernicious error and vice. And by doing so, this is overturning the just order of society, right? Focusing on the youth. We have lots of examples. I mean, think of Nazi Germany. Hitler had a special society or an order called the Hitler Youth Society, where he was propagandizing the youth from an early age to believe in his own doctrines, right? And that's always the case. Communist countries, they own the schools and they teach exactly what they want them to learn. And we know in our own universities today in America, Marxists are filled in the universities, and as we know from the 1900s, communists had infiltrated several places in high government positions. Okay, and also the idea that the Catholic clergy are the enemy to true and useful progress of science and government. Interesting how I've already had a video on the errors of Scientism, so they want to kind of portray Catholic clergy as enemy of progress. So progressives are inherently anti-Christian, and they use science as their dogmas. And it's sad to see so many Catholics ascribe to that which is intended to destroy the church. Very sad. And it's not coincidental that those who have infiltrated the church with many sodomites and pederasts, so you have the Catholic scandals of sexual abuse, so that has even though it's a very small percentage of Catholic clergy, but the way the media blows it up, that puts the opinions in the minds of people that clergy are indeed the enemy of science and progress in government and civil society. So this is a spiritual attack from the enemy. And I'm not defending Catholic clergy who abuse children in any way, shape, or form. In fact, they are to be most detested, should be hung in public, in my opinion. But I'm just saying the Catholic Church has been infiltrated by perverted people, purposely with the mindset of destroying not only the church, but the public perception of the church. And Pope Pius IX, way ahead of his time, saw these things. Okay, next paragraph, quote, "But in truth, others renewing the evil and so many times condemned fabrications and innovators dare with signal impudence to subject the supreme authority of the church and this apostolic see, given to it by Christ the Lord, to the judgment of the civil authority, and to deny all rights of the same church and see with regard to those things which pertain to the exterior order." Close quote. Okay, so basically Pius IX saying these evil people want to remove the supreme authority of the church, and he says also this apostolic see, namely Rome, the Pope of Rome, which was given to it by Christ the Lord, and instead to give that judgment to civil authority. So they want the church to bend the knee to the state and to subordinate itself to the state, whereas actually the inverse order is what was given by God. The state is subordinate to the church, always, except in its own function. The function of the state is not what communists and socialists say it is. Next paragraph, quote, "For they are not at all ashamed to affirm that the laws of the church do not bind in conscience, except when promulgated by the civil power, and that the acts and decrees of the Roman pontiffs relating to religion and the church need the sanction and approval, or at least the assent of the civil power, that the apostolic constitutions in which secret societies are condemned, whether an oath of secrecy is demanded in them or not, and their followers and sympathizers are punished with anathema, have no force in these regions of the world where societies of this sort are allowed by the civil government, that the excommunication uttered by the Council of Trent and Roman pontiffs against those who invade and usurp the rights and possessions of the church rests upon confusion between the spiritual order and the civil and political order for the attaining of the mundane good only, that the church should decree nothing which could bind the consciences of the faithful in relation to the use of temporal goods, that to the church does not belong the right to coerce by temporal punishments violators of its laws, that it is conformable to the principles of sacred theology and to the principles of public law for the civil government to claim and defend ownership of the goods which are possessed by churches, by religious orders, and by other pious places." Close quote. Once upon a time, popes and bishops had authority over even emperors. I forgot which pope it was. He made a certain emperor stand outside in the cold and refuse to talk to him for a certain time because of some public sin that he had been committing unrepentantly. You'd never see something like that today. So basically, this is just saying that the naturalists, the communists, the socialists, they want the church to ask the state for permission to do anything. And that's exactly what we see today. The American Catholic Conference of Bishops receives about, from reports I've read, up to 40% of its revenue from federal tax dollars. So basically, they are at the mercy of the state when they do that, because the state has become the benefactor of the bishops. So that's why you'll never hear today in the Novus Ordo churches, for the most part, any sermons against the state whatsoever. And a lot of the bishops, unfortunately and very sadly and tragically, have become silent in such injustices as abortion and sodomy and so forth, and they will never speak out against it because they're getting paid. They've been bought. Next paragraph, and I'll conclude here. Nor do they quote, nor do they blush to profess openly and publicly the axiom and principle of heretics, from which so many perverse opinions and errors arise. For they repeatedly say that the ecclesiastical power is not by divine right distinct from the independent of the civil power, and that the distinction and independence of the same could not be preserved without the essential rights of the civil power being invaded and usurped by the church. And we cannot pass over in silence and the boldness of those who, not enduring sound doctrine, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3, contend that without sin and with no loss of Catholic profession, one can withhold assent and obedience to those judgments and decrees of the Apostolic See, whose object is declared to relate to the general good of the Church and its rights and discipline, provided it does not touch dogmas of the faith or morals. There is no one who does not see and understand clearly and openly how opposed this is to the Catholic dogma of the plenary power divinely bestowed on the Roman Pontiff by Christ, the Lord himself, of feeding, ruling, and governing the universal Church. In such great perversity of evil opinions, therefore, we, truly mindful of our apostolic duty, and especially solicitous about our most holy religion, about sound doctrine and the salvation of souls divinely entrusted to us, and about the good of human society itself, have decided to lift our apostolic voice again. And so all and each opinion, each evil opinion and doctrine individually mentioned in this letter by our apostolic authority, we reject, proscribe, and condemn. And we wish to command that they be considered as absolutely rejected, proscribed, and condemned by all the sons of the Catholic Church. Close quote. That's the end of the encyclical. So it's clear what the naturalists, the secularists have in mind. It is a war, ultimately between Satan and Christ, and we already know that Christ will win that victory. And it is a war against secularists and the Catholic Church, because the Church is the bride of Christ. So it's no wonder that in Scripture, St. Paul and Jesus both refer to Satan as the, quote, God of this world, meaning the unbelieving world, and the ruler of this world. So the default position of a state, without being infused by the doctrines of the Catholic Church, it will by default collapse and is by default ruled by demonic entities, which are satanic. And it's interesting that Pope Pius IX, he quotes from 2 Timothy chapter 4, who talks about a time is coming where they will not endure sound doctrine, and they will instead adhere to the doctrine of demons, and all sorts of chaos will break loose from that. So, yeah, it's very clear. So this war has been going on, you can argue since the time of Martin Luther, and definitely by the Enlightenment philosophers, and then with Freemasonry, and then with the French Revolution, and then with the Communist Revolution. So, at the end of his encyclical, all these ideas, namely naturalism, which would include Scientism, and Secularism, and also Communism and Socialism, he says we, representing his apostolic authority, reject, proscribe, and condemn. And it is to be condemned also by all the sons of the Catholic Church. So the question, can a Catholic be a socialist? The answer is no. Socialism is evil. All forms of socialism. Just because you put the word democratic before the word socialism, it doesn't make it any better, because as we can clearly see, democracy is the worst form of government, and it can easily be manipulated. So Catholics cannot, in good conscience, they cannot agree with any form of socialism or naturalism or scientism or secularism. It's anathema. Yeah, this isn't extraordinary magisterium, but it is ordinary magisterium, and Catholics are to adhere to ordinary magisterium unless it somehow contradicts earlier dogmas or ordinary magisterium. So no. So now you have the issue of today, many in the Democratic Party in America are coming out and calling themselves socialists. And for years, those who know political philosophy well have identified the Democratic Party with socialism. It's pretty obvious that they agree with the same things. But now they're bold enough and they've become so popular they can come out and just say, yeah, we're socialists. Yeah, and then there are also many people who are giving religious rights to Satanists as a legitimate religion. And many Satanists are also in agreement with the principles of the Democratic Party. It's very troublesome. So it's clearly a spiritual warfare, and it manifests itself in politics, which is why you cannot separate politics from religion. It's cause and effect. They go together. And neither can you separate the church and the state. God desires that the state be a minister of God, but it has a specific function, and the church has a bigger function, and the state must subject itself to the authority of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So that is the proper sense of church and state. So when you destroy the proper sense of church and state, when you make them not be parallel, when you make them go in opposite directions, you're actually bending the knee to Satan and giving him dominion over your politics. That's just how it is. So God bless. Please share this video with your friends. In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen.